This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we welcome to the podcast author, mother, lover of Jesus, yoga instructor, and coffee lover, Khang. In her life, Kathy has moved from newsrooms to parachurch ministry, to training organizational and church leaders, to co-authoring a book entitled More Than Serving Tea, and now having written her own book entitled Raise Your Voice, Why We Stay Silent and How to Speak Up. In this interview, Kathy is candid and vulnerable and speaks with great conviction about the current crisis of racism and anti-Asian hatred in America, as well as offering hope for a future where we respect the dignity of every human being.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast. The Vickers Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square, and two vicars and a musician will not get you front row seats at a ball game, but will entertain you for the next hour or so. We guarantee you that.
Yo, yeah.
I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
Revy Kevy here, Kevin George from St. Aidan's Church in Northwest London.
And my name is Ian. I am the non-vicar of the Vickers Crossing.
That's right. He's the singer-songwriter part. We like to bring melodious realities to our listeners.
Right.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And if it wasn't for Ian, Kevin, like we always say, this would be recorded on our Radio Shack cassette tape.
That's right. Yeah.
So, you know.
Put where you push two buttons down with your fingers and hold out a little microphone. Ian doesn't know what we're talking about, but
no. And a great guest today. We're welcoming in author and speaker and yoga instructor and coffee lover, Kathy Khang will be joining us, and we're going to be talking about her book, which is called Raise Your Voice, Why We Stay Silent and How to Speak Up.
Raise your voice. Raise it. Speak up. Speak up. Speak up.
So before we get to that, though, I'm going to invite Kevin to do our land acknowledgement here.
I should do that.
We'll, yeah.
And speaking of raising voices, folks have been raising voices forever to work towards justice, and we got a long way to go. So today we want to, as a podcast, acknowledge that the lands we are upon are recorded on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenawapak, and Attawandaron peoples on the lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and a Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse indigenous populations, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and we are recognizing them as contemporary stewards of this land and vital contributors of our society. We continue to pray and work towards today when we do have some real and true reconciliation among our peoples.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. I want to say hi to our sponsors too, and our thanks as always to those that help keep our podcast going every week. For all you guys that are listening out there today, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And our thanks to Dave Mullen for his great support over these last few years.
Dave's a great guy. Carol Basada, Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. Get your drugs, just go get your medication. I mean, I'm not meaning like, she doesn't have any crystal meth or anything like that.
It's not that Carol. You might know another Carol.
It's Carol Basada is selling like medication. She's a pharmacist, and Hyde Park Care Pharmacy is just the most incredibly locally owned place. Get yourself away from all that big box stuff and go see a local pharmacist, because she won't just give you your medication. She'll care for you as a person.
And last but certainly not least, we want to say a big thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Trisha Lister was the one who hooked us up with that. So many thanks to her as well.
Let's not wait till tomorrow on that. Rob, I tried to get a hold of Ian for something the other day.
Yeah.
And he said, yeah, well, he says, I'll have to get back to you in a bit because Molly Maid, London, is making my home a healthy haven today in my room. So I can't get in at my equipment to help you out. So
well, that's why Ian always looks so happy and healthy.
Fresh.
Right?
All the time. All the time. For sure.
Big time. So how you guys doing? I haven't seen you since or talked to you before Easter. I haven't seen you in over a year.
I know.
But like within person. But did everybody, I hope you had a good Easter. And
yeah, I think we made the best of it, right? Like, I mean, you guys probably did too out at St. Stephen's, Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Memorial. I mean, we did it all online, and it's sad that we're back into this again. And since we've met, we're gone into a 28-day lockdown here. Or a mock down, depending on how you look at it. I just drove over here now, and I don't know who's locked down, to be honest. But it's just a shame that we didn't do this right the first time. There's no excuse for this third wave. If we had held our ground after the February thing and stayed in this a little bit longer, we'd be coming out of it instead of going into it now. But hey, here we are. We're going to make the best of it. The vaccines are rolling out. We just news today that 60 and older are able to get their vaccines now.
Oh, really? Okay. Yep. I didn't hear that. That's good news. And I know that there's a lot more pharmacies that are going to be available in the London area anyway.
31. Now, so that means
from 2 to 31.
Right. Yeah. And they're doing 55 and up. Right. So basically after tomorrow, everybody over the age of 55 up will be able to get access to a vaccine, and there's talk of the numbers shifting again next week. So
yeah. Good. Cool. And Ian, are you almost done school?
Yeah, it's starting into exam season, and one of the big things that we have coming up is a show. So Music Industry Arts is putting on a concert.
Yes.
Share the Land. You probably have heard of it. Yes. And it's just, there's a lot of behind the scenes going on, but it's super exciting because
what's the date for that, Ian? Can our listeners find it?
Well, yeah. So I was about to say, April 24th at 7:00. You can get your tickets online where you would normally get tickets. There'll probably be a link pretty much everywhere. Everywhere, if you just search Share the Land on Facebook or Instagram, there'll probably be a link in the description of this podcast as well. But get your tickets. Idea. It's really, really cool. It's going to be a cool show. Canadian music, Canadian people. It's just it's in honor of it's the 10-year anniversary in honor of Jack Richardson as well. So that's cool.
Oh, wow.
And
that's cool.
And it's helping out local London music venues, which is cool as well. So
well, let's see if we can get. We'll put the link on our webpage, The Victor's Crossing.
Yeah, victorscrossing.com. You'll get the link there.
We can find it there. So
for sure.
Now, what Ian just told us, we know is not a joke or a fib, or he's not trying to, pull our legs and get you to sign up for something that's not going to happen. Ian's not a liar. However,
no,
we're going to enter into a segment of our podcast now where he'll have that opportunity to enter into the dark side. It's a little segment that we like to call.
It's not a lie if you believe it.
It's not a lie if you believe it.
Georgie Costanza.
Right. So one of us is going to tell a little story today, and today it's going to be Ian.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's up to Kevin and I to try to figure out, and you listening, of course, to figure out if Ian's lying or telling the truth, and if it is a lie and he believes it's the truth anyway.
Well, whatever, right?
Oh yeah. Then here's one about how because everyone knows that I'm such a big rebel. I rebel coursing through my veins. So here's a story of, or it could be complete fabrication of me when I was younger, and specifically in elementary school. Okay. And I had a tradition with myself where, and I'm not proud to admit this.
Listen, hold on. Nothing to be ashamed of. Everybody grows up, so yes, go ahead, Ian. Just go ahead. Unburden yourself, Ian.
I made a deal with myself that every grade year I would steal someone's pen that I really liked and not give it back.
The pen or the person?
The writing utensil. It could have been like a nice pencil or a nice pen. Okay, and I made a deal with myself to do that every school year. So you weren't stealing the pen from a person you like. You were stealing a pen you liked. I was stealing a pen I liked. Okay. The person is irrelevant.
That's rebellious. I thought you were going to say something terrible, like you didn't change the toilet paper on the roller.
I'm not going to say what I thought.
But okay. Oh, I don't know. What do you think, Kev?
Rob, I think I think he's up there with James Dean. Such a rebel.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Rebel with a cause.
Rebel. Yeah.
I don't know, Ian. It doesn't sound like you to be stealing pens. I mean, I know your mother. I don't know. Rob, what do you say? I'm going to say no. I'm going to say it's a lie.
Okay, you're going to say no. Hey, we've all had crazy times in our teenage years that we look back and say, what was I thinking? That was ridiculous. So I even say that Ian may possibly have entered into that stage, and the pen's really not too far-fetched. So I'll say, yeah, I could see Ian maybe scoffing a few pens here and there.
Well, I cannot tell a lie. I did steal writing utensils from my elementary school years.
You are nuts, man.
You are a scallywag. Is what you are.
Such a rebel. Oh,
You're
totally.
a scallywag.
Yeah.
You know what you are? You're a hang-ashore. That's what you are.
Of course I am.
What's a hang-ashore?
A hang-ashore is a fellow who's too lazy to go out and boat. Catch his fish and make his money. You hang ashore. You steal the fish instead of go catch it.
I think I still have a lot of them too in my desk over here. So
something about the pens that were drawn Ian in, eh? Wow.
Yeah, I was just like, I want that.
It's a little obsessive, I think.
A little bit.
That's a cool Scooby-Doo pen. They probably.
I bet you he's got a bag of toenails somewhere too.
Perfect. Perfect. All right, good. Well, we found out a little bit more about Ian's rebellious years in high school.
All right.
Elementary school.
Elementary school. No, we're talking about a little kid thief.
Yeah, this was like from grades 4 to like actually maybe a little bit into high school, but nothing.
Oh no, we're talking about a little thief here.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, remember, guys, it's not a lie if you believe it, and that wraps up another segment of that. Okay, is Kathy here? I think Kathy's here.
Kathy Khang is with us. Let's let her in.
Let's bring her in. And we are so happy to welcome Kathy Khang into our Zoom room today in the Vickers Crossing. Kathy, welcome, and we're so glad you're with us. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing well, actually. The sun is out today, so everything is good.
Good. And you're telling us you're just you're north of Chicago, right?
Yes, I am north of Chicago. Yeah.
Beautiful Chicago, which I would say, and we all miss. I miss going to Chicago. I miss Lou Malnati's. I love Lou Malnati's pizza.
Oh, yes. Ooh. Well, thankfully, there is one here in Libertyville.
Ooh,
so
make me jealous,
whenever
Kathy.
we have out-of-town guests, we make sure we do Lou Malnati's deep dish, butter crust, and Portillo's Italian beef.
Oh, yeah, man. Oh, man.
Oh, that's good. My tummy's grumbling already. Here we go. That's good. Well, we're so happy you're here, Kathy. We're going to talk about your book and some other things as well. So let's get right into it. Kevin?
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, actually, there's a couple of books that you should check out. And I see behind Kathy, actually, next to that incredibly nice sign that says, I'm speaking, Kamala Harris, but is the cover of both books, Raise Your Voice, which is her most recent book, and her project with others called More Than Serving Tea. Did I get it right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. And both books are phenomenal. Read them both. You're an incredible voice and a very much a needed voice right now for us in this world. And we appreciate you, Kathy, taking time with us today. I wanted to begin, if we can, and if you'll bear with me, there's a little bit to get through here, but just by confronting this sort of this anti-Asian rise in anti-Asian violence and this prejudice and racism that we see, not just in the United States, by the way, but here in Canada as well. On March the 16th, a series of mass shootings occurred at 3 spas and massage parlors in the metropolitan area of Atlanta, Georgia. 8 people were killed. 6 of them were Asian women, and 1 other person was wounded. 21-year-old Robert Aaron Long was taken into custody later that day, and he has not been charged with a hate crime, although it's hard to understand why. And even listening to the police officer watching this live on CNN at the time talking about how he had a bad day, I nearly spit up my lung. I thought, really? He had a bad day? I mean, what is this? This is, of course, shocking for those of us who have the benefit of white privilege, but for all too many Americans, Asian Americans, this is shocking but not surprising somehow, because you've lived with this sort of anti-Asian racism. The advocacy group Stop AAPI Hate is said to have received more than 2,800 reports of hate incidents directed at Asian Americans nationwide last year. And those incidents include An 84-year-old Thai immigrant in San Francisco, California, dying last month after being violently shoved to the ground during his morning walk. In Oakland, California, a 91-year-old senior was shoved to the pavement from behind. An 89-year-old Chinese woman slapped and set on fire by two people in Brooklyn, New York. The list is too painful and too long to read. This is a problem not unique to the United States. Just last week, a 52-year-old Toronto man, was ordering food at a local restaurant when a man said an anti-Asian slur at him. He then easy for you to say, allegedly punched the victim before fleeing the scene. The man was taken to the hospital and received treatment for his injuries. Vancouver police just this past year have documented a significant jump, reporting from 12 cases of anti-Asian violence or hate acts of hate in 2019 to 98 cases in 2020. The Chinese Canadian National Council's Toronto chapter earlier this month said that it's received information from recent surveys regarding 1,150 incidents of anti-Asian racism during the pandemic, with almost half of those incidents taking place in the first 2 months of 2021. I mean, this is just beyond the pale. It's terrifying stuff. I mean, when I reached out to Kathy a few weeks ago after the Atlanta incident, and we were texting, I said to her, that it's shocking, and she texted back and said, "Well, as a mom, it's terrifying."
Yeah.
And I realized again just how white privilege sort of permeates our lives, because for me, I look at it and say, "Boy, this is surprising and shocking and horrible." But I don't live in Kathy's body, where it's not just shocking and surprising, it's actually terrifying. And you tweeted, in fact, just earlier this month, "I'm worried about my parents' safety because older AAPI have been targets. I'm worried for my daughter in New York City. My parents called me worried for her and for me while I was driving to Iowa alone. Generational trauma. Stop AAPI hate." Can you respond to like that litany of what I just said, and talk about that generational trauma and perhaps your own experience of how you've experienced these sort of racist attitudes in your own life?
Sure. Well, I think the challenge has been to continue to educate people on racism against Asian Americans and racism in general, right? So I think here, particularly in the United States, but not just here, the idea of racism is tied to like the Ku Klux Klan and people wearing white hoods and burning crosses. But in reality, that is part of racism, but it's not always expressed in those ways. And growing up, I know that my parents faced racism, but I wouldn't say that that's what they would name it, right? Because as immigrants, their desire was less so much assimilation, but survival. And so you just kind of take on and deal with whatever comes at you. Maybe they didn't understand the terms that were thrown at them. They most certainly understood the treatment that they were receiving, but they were also just trying to survive and manage. And it wasn't really until my sister and I have a younger sister, we went to school and then experienced racism. And then even then, as a kindergartner, as an elementary school child, would I have been able to say, this is racism? No, but I can look back and say, oh, there were incidents that were definitely racist. There was the typical playground teasing, and then the teasing got more threatening to physical harm and being afraid to walk home from school, and not knowing where was safe on the school bus or where was safe on the playground, things like that. And so that's what I carried into my adulthood, right? So all of those experiences, and then, as an adult and in the workplace, and then having children. My husband is also Korean American. He's American born, US born. And our children are obviously Asian American. And so then we go into this other mode of wondering how they are going to encounter racism, and then to give them language for that treatment that we didn't have growing up.
Right.
Right. And so then you fast forward to 2016-ish, give or take, and the political situation here in the United States, and then fast forward, or in this case, a little bit of a reverse, to when COVID starts to hit the news in North America. And when the news reports first started coming out about this novel coronavirus out of China, most of my Asian American friends and I knew right away that this was going to spell trouble for our community, because of the then president and the racialized terms that he would use very early on, starting in February and March of last year. It was even back then that I was having conversations with my parents. And we were having conversations about how would they wear masks outside when they were going on their daily walks and going about life. And if they wore masks, what were the implications of that? And so was it safer or more dangerous before mask mandates became normal here in Illinois? What was the safer way to operate? And because we're Korean American, Asian American, we also still have friends and family members in Korea, right? So the idea of wearing a mask in public is not completely absurd for us. And so we kind of went back and forth, and how it would be safer or riskier. I asked my parents to make sure that they were taking their walks in kind of more populated areas so that there would be people, but also not too populated because it wouldn't be too dangerous. And then that never really went away, even with the mask mandates, because even with a mask, we can't fully hide our ethnic identity. And so there was concern about how people would respond to us or what would happen to us. I had an incident that happened very early on in March of last year. And I found out later that my daughter, who lives in New York, had also encountered some experiences during the year of people, kind of coughing in her direction, or kind of trying to get into her personal space. And it was obvious because it was during a time where we were told, 6 feet
Stay
apart,
away,
wear masks, right? All of those things. And then with the more recent reported cases of physical violence, it's the typical thing that the parent of a young woman would say is to be aware of your surroundings, and then to be much more heightened, like don't even put in your AirPods, don't listen to anything, just be completely aware, have your phone handy, know how to like quickly start recording. And it was in that, that phone call where my parents knew that I was driving alone, and they had, been hearing about the reports. And I just thought, the strange reality that we were living in, that my dad, who is 80 years old, is calling me up to make sure that I stop, that in well-lit truck stops, and wanting to make sure that my daughter was okay because she had not responded to a text right away. So all of this going on, and feeling like, and that we're carrying this every day.
Right.
And that's, I mean, when just to think about too, you said in the middle of that, you mentioned the previous occupant of the White House and what, the sort of rhetoric. This plays a factor. I mean, we can't ignore the importance of words. And I mean, just here this week, in a town southwest of here, in a place called Essex, there's a town councillor called Chris Vanderdoel, and he's a former columnist at their local paper, who tweeted to another person, "You pathetic socialist git. COVID stands for Chinese origin virus, etc." only apologists for their murderous regime take issue with it. And myself and some others called that out on social media. The city or the town mayor says he's had a lot of calls and so on and so on. No apology, no change. It's just, you know what? Yeah, and it's just like with the previous president. There's this sort of insistence that it's just a tweet.
Right.
But hearing you tell that painful sort of reality, which we don't ever have to worry about, we're pretty. Look at us, for God's sake. We can't get whiter. That's heartbreaking. But these words matter, don't they?
Oh, they absolutely matter. They absolutely matter, which is why more than a year ago, the Asian American community broadly knew that the racialized terminology that was attached to it was going to be problematic, and that we've been arguing against that since last February, maybe January, and that it's also, I mean, then to put it in the context, a broader context, is that it's a new and different conversation that we have realized that we have not had to have, right? So we're not Black. Our family is not a Black family here in the United States. And so we've not had to have similar conversations around being pulled over. And there was just another incident Sunday morning, I believe, Sunday evening, up in the Minneapolis area. Right. And again, I think it's the lived experience is so different for those of us. And with COVID, I think it has heightened my awareness as an Asian American in times when I think I became a little complacent. I recognize that the racism I face doesn't go away, but I, to be honest, have not necessarily felt the physical fear of being harmed. But that has obviously changed.
Sad.
Well, like Kevin said, words matter, which is why I think, for me, a book like yours is so important, because there's an opportunity in reading this, I think, and we're going to talk a little bit about your book now, to have people use their voices and make their words matter in a way that stands up and stands next to those that are at the end of some of those horrible words. So it's important for us to have this discussion. So the book is Raise Your Voice: Why We Stay Silent and How to Speak Up. And I just wanted to offer a little bit of reading from the introduction of your book, Kathy, for our listeners today. You write about why finding our voices and raising our voices are so critical. And so in introduction, you write this: at some point in our lives, we learn to communicate, whether verbally or non-verbally. But most of us are also taught to silence ourselves or to stay out of the conversation for self-preservation. We are taught to avoid conflict, to keep the peace, to keep our personal opinions to ourselves, because we're told that speaking out doesn't actually affect change. However, self-preservation takes on a different sense of urgency and meaning as the national and global political landscape continues to shift, as we've talked about. The North American Church is again engaging in conversations around race and justice, but because of its past failures and current blind spots, the conversation often resorts to simplified binaries such as white and Black, men and women, privileged and lack of privilege, citizen and undocumented, and the refusal to dig deeper into racist and unjust systems can widen the chasm. I believe that Christians desire and can handle more complexity. Race and reconciliation can no longer be framed solely as a justice issue, but rather as core to the gospel, theologically grounded in the Imago Dei, the image of God. And as Christians, if we truly believe we are all created in God's image, and that God the Creator had a hand in developing, creating, and shaping not just our embodied souls, but also the places and spaces we steward and have dominion over, then reconciliation with one another is not merely an option. It is part of God's mandate, and it requires us to speak up and to speak out.
Amen.
Yeah, amen. In our Anglican tradition or Episcopalian tradition in the U.S., our baptismal covenants, those words are so powerful, where we promise to seek and serve Christ in all persons and to strive for the dignity and to hold up the dignity of every human being. Can you talk more, Kathy, today about this critical component of our faith that you spoke of in the introduction there, and why it's so important with respect to race and gender and orientation and ethnicity?
Well, I appreciated the Anglican Episcopalian verbiage there, and I really kind of honed in on to strive for the dignity, as opposed to just sit around and assume that it will happen naturally, right?
It'll show up eventually.
It'll
if we
show
don't-
up eventually, or if we just kind of pray it into being. Right, the idea that it is to strive, and that when you are striving, there is also going to be some resistance to it. And I think that's part of the importance, is that that's God's invitation to us from the get-go. It isn't some sort of like extracurricular on the side, and it's core to our understanding, or should be core to our understanding of the gospel, right? That it is for the dignity of every human being. And I really appreciated how you said there, Rob, about, it's gender, it's race, it's orientation, it's class, it's all of those things that we do have to actually take action. It isn't going to change by us simply sitting around and talking about it. And I had wrestled with the idea of this book for a long time, mainly in part because it felt like it was going to, I have often been accused of being divisive.
Oh, Lord,
right?
you're
So
in
that's
good
my
company
favorite.
now.
Yeah, it's super fun. As opposed to saying, actually, I'm not raising issues that don't exist. I'm actually just kind of pointing out what I think is pretty obvious. But let's talk about what is obvious to me and what is not obvious to you, because it impacts the lives of people created in God's image. And so for me, it was really, this book is really about calling my fellow believers in the church, capital C, regardless of your denomination, experience, membership, all of that, is to say, when we say we believe we are all created in God's image, and that we are invited into flourishing, that means everybody.
Right.
Not just a few people that we're really comfortable with.
Right. Exactly.
And so that's why words matter. Words matter on Sunday through Saturday. And then it matters how we act on those words, especially for those of us who say we are believers. How are we going to be the gospel? How are we going to live the gospel, as opposed to how are we going to throw our chosen Bible verses at people and then think that that's going to work?
Right. Yeah, it's fun. I was having a conversation with somebody around that same line recently, because we've just come through Easter Sunday and now we're into the Easter season. And if our understanding is that in the resurrection of Jesus, God's got a new project underway, and the kingdom is now among us. How do we participate in that? Or is Easter just the day we left there on Sunday? Right. So now this is where the striving begins, because God has initiated something new at Easter. And now how are we going to join in on that? Right. So it was the same kind of stuff you were mentioning there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Because if the only thing Easter stands for is that people get dressed up and we do Easter eggs and something about a rabbit, that is so problematic.
Yeah, I very problematic for rabbits to be laying eggs, if you ask me.
Yes. Well, it's kind of strange. I don't really understand it.
I think that you're really right. I mean, the whole sort of manifestation of the gospel of resurrection is this realization of a world that this peasant Jewish itinerant preacher lived in his life. So it's not simply about that day, as Robert said. There's something bigger at work. Now,
Right.
are we going to join into that conversation? Well, if it does, it may mean we too have to sacrifice. We too have to come alongside of places where there's injustice and pain and suffering, and sort of dig deep, right? So
Mhm.
those things are hard work, and we don't often want to pick up the hard work bit.
Right, right. We'd
So,
rather just eat chocolate
yes.
Oh yeah.
bunnies,
Yes.
I guess, chocolate bunnies.
Yeah,
Well,
I know there's nothing like watching your sugar skyrocket when you're a diabetic on Easter. Well, doctor, it was Easter. I was forced to eat a bunny.
Sorry.
So yes, a bunny? Well, a chocolate bunny. Anyway, on from that, because they'll get me going. Speaking of scripture, I wanted to sort of pick up one of the threads that runs through your book. There's a chapter which really focuses on it, but it picks up throughout the book, is Esther. You really have a thing for Esther.
I do.
And so I found it to be just really incredibly insightful. And that I did speaks to what your point is in the book, which is, white cisgender guy just doesn't pick up on these important nuances that are there. You write, a common retelling of the book of Esther is through a white male lens. Esther is a winner of a beauty pageant, and the titles of king and queen are filtered through Western understanding of power and some degree of equality, if not equity and agency for both king and queen. But when I look at Esther's story, you write, I see racial passing and the implications of a young disenfranchised woman who has assimilated but not completely lost her culture, accepting the opportunity to seek justice for her people in a misogynistic culture. I see how Esther couldn't have come to her journey if it were not for the prior example of Queen Vashti, who first chose to speak out by refusing the king's demands for what amounts to a lap dance for his friends. I was like, yes, you preach, Kathy. I mean, this is incredible. So you share about your own experience in discussing Esther and about how your own lived experience around issues like passing and all that stuff. Can you share some of that with our listeners to give some sense of why Esther is so important to you?
Sure. So I know Esther as Esther, but my Jewish friends know her as Hadassah. And celebrations around Hadassah are very different than our lack of celebrations and recognition in the Christian tradition, Protestant tradition around Esther. And up until I would say maybe my 20s, my take on Esther was from like the felt board Sunday school stories.
Right.
So,
Oh, of course.
yes, right. So kind of aging myself,
Yeah.
but kind of very very two-dimensional, very flat, very white. And it really was the story of like this young girl winning a beauty pageant. She was so beautiful that the king chose her to be our queen. And when I started really looking at Esther, I was one, a little mortified. And two, that the idea that she was known as both Hadassah and Esther, and that at the request of her older cousin, though in the felt board stories, I was always told it was her uncle.
Yeah.
Right,
That's
that
right.
right, that she was pretty much told, like, don't tell anyone you're Jewish, just kind of go with it. And I really have, and I'm still kind of working through how the idea of assimilation is often portrayed as wanting to be white for Asian Americans. And I'm sure there was a time middle school is bad for everyone, high school, but I love being Korean American. But the idea of assimilation was always portrayed as my having some desire to be white.
Right.
And when I look at Esther, she is not desiring to be Persian. She is desiring to survive. And survive as best she can in a culture that says, well, you have no parents that we know of in the story, and you're not married. So this might be the best opportunity for you, is to be a part of the king's harem. And so I think of the fact that my family know me as Kyung-ah, which is my Korean name, and they know me as Khang Kyung-ah, which is the family name first and then the given name. And it's just the rest of the world that knows me as Kathy, right? And so it's a very different reality because my given Korean name has this history tied to it.
Right.
And very few people know about it unless you read the book.
Right.
You know, it's similar with Esther and Hadassah, and then even in our traditions of the Protestant tradition versus the Jewish tradition, and how Hadassah is honored. And Esther is just kind of one of a few women who get to be named in scripture. And then that Esther finds herself in a position where she has to leverage what little bit of privilege and power that she has. And it's not explicit, we're told, right? Like the king might not recognize her because he actually has a lot of women and that she could be killed for going up and presenting herself to the king before she is called or summoned. And so I think a lot about the places and spaces women, and particularly women of color, we find ourselves in, is that we are not in positions of power per se, but that we have to learn how do we hold some amount of privilege, and then ultimately how are we invited to speak up and act on behalf of God's people. What can we do in our kind of space and realm of influence that might be risky, that feels dangerous, that can feel subversive, because we feel so strongly and that we have an opportunity to do so. And that's where I really connect and sit with Esther as an invitation and a challenge. Is she really didn't need to do what she did, because we're reminded, right? God will find and raise someone else up.
Right. Wow, that's great.
Right.
I'm writing a note here, like when's Esther up next?
Yeah, when's Esther coming up? You got to go to Kathy's book. It'll preach. Believe me, it'll preach. You know, it's interesting. My wife was born in Seoul on the American naval base, Kathy. And so for our 20th anniversary 5 years ago, I brought her there. She always wanted to go back. She left as an infant, sort of like you did from Korea. So she'd never been. So we went. And it's interesting listening to you talk about that business around assimilation and around Western ideology, because one of the things that, and by the way, like we traveled the whole sort of South Korean peninsula, which was amazing. Your homeland is incredible.
Yeah.
And, but I was taken by the beauty industry and the obsession with westernizing the look of women. Like, it's just shocking to me. I mean, the bleaching and all kinds of, and it was all new to me. And again, this speaks to ignorance in terms of privilege, but it was a very shocking thing to me. I don't know if you would say a word or two about that, but I mean, there's a whole, and it's a massive industry. There's a whole massive industry in Korea, which really is around pushing a westernized idea of what women should look like.
Yes. Oh, and men too.
Men too.
Yeah. And that's more of a recent development there. And that has been around for decades, right? So there's the colorism that already existed in the culture.
Right.
Because if you were in the rural areas, working on a farm, outside, you were darker.
Right.
And, but if you were of the higher class, you were inside, you had servants, so you were fairer skinned. And so I remind folks that there is anti-Blackness, but there is also colorism.
Interesting.
And the anti-Blackness introduced by the military,
of course,
and and war, not just in Korea, but all across Asia, and the military bases are still there.
Oh, it's huge. It's
in
shocking.
Korea, right?
It's shocking.
Oh yeah, there are entire towns, right? Entire cities kind of built around the military bases there that kind of the US exported its racism.
Mhm.
And so then it kind of creates this mix. And so the nose surgeries and the eyelid surgeries, those, I remember those when I was in high school.
Wow.
um and even dating before that. So I have creases in my lids, born with these. And I remember growing up and how other Korean women would comment on the shape of my eyes. And so there is something about what gets exported through militarization, colonization, occupation.
Yeah, I was going
What
to say
is
occupation. It's sort
ideal?
of, it's sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no.
But it's sort of, that was my, I mean, and part of getting there was we went on to base because Catherine and I wanted to see where she was born, all that stuff.
Yeah,
But a part of it really felt like, wow, this is, and the thing about the West here is we forget that the war is not over in Korea, right? Like, I mean,
correct.
it's a ceasefire.
Right.
And so when you get there and you realize it's an occupied peninsula.
Yes, it is. It is. And and if you've ever been to the DMZ,
We
it's
went,
very
it's shocking.
strange and surreal. And and then again, that whole situation was brought up again during the last administration and the former president's relationship with
Kim Jong-un.
the North Korean regime. And so but even in all of that, again, it's the what is ideal. And
Right.
it's a Western ideal. And what is a classic beauty? It's a Western
Right.
classic beauty. And why is that negative when that has meant survival? Right. So it's the let's talk about how that turns around. Yes, it's a horrible, frightening industry.
Yes.
And yet, can you blame us?
Right. Why would it be there?
Right?
Why
Yeah,
would it be
exactly,
there?
yeah.
Except for
Yeah.
the fact that there's, as you say, there's something been imported.
Right. Right. A value, a judgment, and who gets the modeling gigs, right? Like it's all of that
Sure.
meshed and tied and
Yeah.
messy. Yeah.
And one of the other reasons, like you write about needing to raise your voice, is because you are a woman. And you've worked in like male dominated industries, which, first of all, I hate the fact that a lot of industries are male dominated. It's ridiculous.
He says
Moving on.
as three of us are on the screen with you.
That's right. Yeah.
You tell a story in the book about being a woman in ministry in that male dominated environment. I was wondering if you could read that short section about that for us, and then on the other side I'll have a quick question.
Yeah. So almost 10 years ago, I supervised a ministry staff team that worked with 4 distinct student populations with a reach of about 300 active students. I learned that a group of local Asian American pastors were meeting periodically to talk about ministry and leadership and pray for one another, but I never received an invitation to those meetings. A few years later, I hired a graduating student leader, a young Korean American man, to join my staff. He fairly quickly received an invitation to attend the pastor's gathering. Holding back tears, I told him that I had never been invited to attend those meetings. Still, with a mix of frustration based on my experience and hope for what he might experience, I told him that I wanted him to go, learn, and speak into that group. It took him a moment to realize what the significance of the invitation was for him and what the lack of an invitation meant for me. 10 years of ministry at that point wasn't enough credibility to overcome the fact that I am a woman.
That's ridiculous.
I agree, Ian.
You have,
So stupid.
you have
That's
offended
right,
the
Ian.
20-year-old. The 20-year-old says this is bullshit. I'll have none of it.
Stupid.
Says
That-
bullshit of the highest order.
That frustrates me to no end. Okay. Anyway, in the Anglican Church, they've been ordaining women for like 40 years. Yet many a woman female priests, women priests.
Mhm.
I don't know which one's correct in grammatic, but moving on. Many female priests share similar stories, which is stupid. Can you say more about your experience of being silenced because you were a woman, and why raising your voice as a woman is so important and critical?
So I am learning some lessons even as of late.
Yeah.
So I left vocational ministry 2 years ago. I had been in vocational ministry for more than 20 years at
Wow.
that point. And had come onto vocational ministry already having had 5 years working as a newspaper reporter. So it wasn't like I
Yeah.
didn't know what I was doing when I went into ministry. I mean, I didn't,
Right.
but you know, I had
Right.
work experience. And so, so even in this kind of recent reporting around Asian American, anti-Asian American racism and violence, I learned that because I no longer had like a vocational ministry title, I wasn't affiliated with an organization, so I didn't have a title. And I am not an ordained minister.
Mhm.
As people were looking for experts
Yeah.
and people to be present at rallies or gatherings, that I didn't qualify.
Oh Lord. Really?
And and I would say, you know, not just because I didn't have the titles, but also because of the time in which I was doing that kind of vocational ministry, married, raising 3 children. You know, the idea did not cross my mind that at some point I should get a master's degree or get ordained just to have that as some sort
Right.
of,
Didn't Jesus say get
title.
the an MDiv or something like that?
Right, right.
Yeah,
I
that's right.
Right in the
Yeah,
Bible.
about that.
It's
Yeah.
ridiculous.
somewhere there in like Joan chapter 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I know that folks were looking for like female pastors or female Asian American leaders of organizations.
Mhm.
And I had to push back and just say, do you understand what you're asking
Right.
for?
Yeah.
And how even in the Asian American context, maybe even more so, that is challenging.
Mhm.
And that I have had to continue to ask male colleagues, don't answer for me.
Right.
So don't assume I can't do a project because you think I might be busy with my children,
Right.
right? You would never do that to a male colleague.
Well,
So don't do that to me because you know that I will drive round trip in one day
yeah.
to Ames, Iowa and back.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean I can't fit other things into my life. I'm
Right.
probably better at it because my
That's right.
entire life has been managing multiple spheres of influence. And so I
Mhm.
would say, unfortunately, Ian, the ridiculousness continues. 2021, it's still the same garbage,
Yes.
you know, same song, different verse.
Well, you know, interestingly here, one of the recent things that many of us have been chatting about is we've still got people in our Anglican circles who march around insisting on being called father, for instance, where we've been ordaining women for over 40 years. And so they come to meeting. Rob and I'll show up at a meeting and someone's, well, hello, father. And then they'll look at my male or my female colleague and say, you know, hello, Joan. You know, it's just wrong.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what is it you said it was, Ian? It was
Stupid.
Stupid.
I think the correct words were fucking stupid, but I'm not sure if I should.
Okay.
Now we've got to put a warning on the
I was
podcast
going to
again.
say, you didn't tell me I could swear.
Oh no, swearing is totally allowed here. So now we're going to have to put a warning on the podcast.
Gonna
that
be
there's foul
explicit
language.
now.
There's explicit
Great.
language.
Ian-
Oh,
Ian went off the rails
we were doing
again.
so good.
Listen.
We were doing so good.
I'm pissed.
All right. Next part of the book we want to talk about. This was a great section of the book. Everyone has a part. You write a chapter about this, pointing out that speaking up and using our voices is not a competition. And again, I want to read just a short excerpt from that. You write, encourage others to find their voices just as you find your voice. Part of learning to speak up is also about encouraging others to do the same. Our personal growth and development doesn't happen in a vacuum. We were created with community and mutual flourishing in mind. That's why it's important to help others, even as we are trying to figure out our own voice. And this is such a critical piece, I think, of what we've been talking about. And I know in the wake of the tragedies like the George Floyd murder, shootings in Atlanta, recently, as you mentioned, in Minneapolis just yesterday, there's been that increased sense of awareness of racial injustice. This time of pandemic has served to be apocalyptic in the sense of a veil's been lifted. We've talked about that many times on our podcast to reveal so much. And like many endeavors, we here at the Vickers Crossing have made an effort in the last year to be more aware of who we are and who our guests are, who encourage, and we want to encourage that work. And we are very mindful, the three of us, as Kevin's already mentioned it a few times, that we are three white, cisgender, heterosexual males, not an exact picture of diversity here. And we've got a lot of work to do and a long way to go. But your book, I think, is an encouragement to us and to others to continue to find ways to raise diverse voices. You give some very helpful suggestions on how to encourage others to raise their voices, even as we're trying to figure out our own, as you said. So what can we be doing, Kathy, to raise our voices? What can our listeners, those that are tuned in today, do to help raise theirs as well?
Yeah. So, I laugh when you remind me that you are three white men.
Yeah, because you didn't notice.
I couldn't tell. And a podcast that I co-host, I also co-host with three white men. We often talk about that. That understanding, and myself, right? I am an Asian American woman, but I'm also cisgender heterosexual. So in that space, I inhabit kind of the majority culture around us, right? It's assumed. So fully recognizing that, I think one of the things I want to push listeners beyond, like, yes, of course, I would want you to read and buy my book. But we saw here last summer, I think it was, like, the New York Times bestseller list included so many books about anti-racist work. And yet here we are.
And right? it didn't take.
It didn't, like, it was great that people bought the books. It's unclear whether or not they read the books, right? So I have a habit of buying books that I don't always get around to reading right away. And so I want to push listeners beyond just getting and gaining knowledge, because I think that is a failure of the Western Protestant church, right? It's very cerebral. It's what we know about God. And then we don't really have to do much with that. And I would say the doing part is so key. So who are the people in your day-to-day life who have less privilege, but still have an important voice and influence, whether it's in your home or your neighborhood or your church or the school, right? Like all of those levels and layers of being and occupying space in the world. And I hate it when folks like us with a level of privilege then get into a space of feeling really guilty and maybe even ashamed of that privilege, and then want to just drop it. Right. And like, I don't want it anymore. For me, it's like, no. Actually, what would be really helpful is then how do you, not in a kind of weird big brother sort of like, oh, my poor little brother, how do you then share that power and privilege? How do you expand and be creative? I think that's one thing I find that I lack the imagination of how to use my influence. So, like your podcast, right? Who are the guests you bring? I talk about that all the time with my co-hosts. That's the part I love is who are the voices that we kind of day to day might not come across,
Mhm.
let's get them on as a guest. Oh, this book is not going to be a New York Times bestseller, but hey, this is really important and we should be reading it and introducing it. Or, hey, there's this great movie that just came out and
Right.
it's not going to be in the theaters because most of the theaters are still closed.
Right.
And how do we get people to kind of overcome any sense of, oh, I don't want to watch captions, closed captions, and I don't want to, read words on a screen.
Mhm.
I think those are the ways in which we can do some work
Mhm.
that doesn't have to feel so much like work, right? There's like the day-to-day consumption of information and entertainment, but then also doing things that might feel a little more uncomfortable and divisive. So when something happens in your local community and some voted elected official makes a racist comment,
Mhm.
bring it up,
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
talk
talk
about
about
it with your neighbors.
Mhm.
It really is kind of the normal day-to-day exchanges that I want to encourage white people to engage in.
Right.
Mhm.
And that's
So
the striving that we were talking about,
yeah,
isn't it? The
yeah,
participatory work of doing the work on the ground, which is oftentimes difficult.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's uncomfortable.
Right.
Right. And you don't know how it's going to turn out. And
Mhm.
so, like, just before I was here, I was donating blood. And I'm chatting with a woman who's drawing blood. And while she's doing all this other stuff, I'm reading my phone, reading about the George Floyd case and the other shooting that had happened yesterday, sometime Sunday. And she asked me, oh, is there something going on today? I had to make a choice whether or not to say what I was reading. And
Right.
then when I told her, she had to make a choice of whether or not she was going to engage me.
Right.
And she said, people say there is no systemic racism. They
Yeah.
keep ignoring the obvious. And and unfortunately, I was surprised
Right.
that this white woman engaged in that conversation. And I was so grateful.
Right.
Um, and she said the same thing. She goes, it's really hard when it's donors, you never know, but this was so refreshing. I'm
Yeah.
so glad we could talk. That required both of us to engage in what was potentially an awkward, uncomfortable conversation.
It's risking.
Yeah.
You have to risk. And one of the places you talk about risking is around social media. And as one who's gotten himself into it a little bit on social media, I figured I should ask this question, as I tend to be a bit provocative, if you will. But I mean, I think that the point is, as you said earlier, it's not about trying to be divisive. It's about trying to raise the level of discourse around the things that we like. I mean, kittens are fine, but they don't quite cut it in terms of what's going on. Kittens in the face of what's happened to George Floyd, for instance,
Right.
are downright insulting. I mean, like,
Right.
it's that sort of stuff. So you write about raising your voice on social media. So I'm compelled to ask you about the importance of this, thinking more than once I've had people tell me, you know what, I'm going to leave Facebook. I'm going to leave Twitter. Kevin, you should leave Facebook, leave Twitter, and there's times I feel like I should. There's times I'm like, I can't deal with this anymore. It's just way too much. But I also, I can't, because it's a part of, I mean, we use it as a part of elevating this platform. We can raise voices like your own and others, and to sort of walk away from it, is to cut your nose off to spite your face. It's really about how we use that. And so you write, engaging in online exchanges, particularly the larger scale organized online actions I've been a part of, is never about creating conflict for conflict's sake. It's always about the truth of the gospel and how it's being incorrectly communicated through stereotypes or through dangerous policies and practices. This isn't about forcing the church to be politically correct or about an individual speaking their mind. It's about how the church and its leaders and members bear false witness in their public leadership. It's about inviting other sisters and brothers to be a church that more accurately reflects the beauty and diversity of the church. So a two-part question here, and this sort of harkens back a little bit to what I said earlier about the town councillor down in Essex who, and because several of us got online and elevated that racism, he's at least taken the tweet down because he's been called out by the community, and there are those, rallying to say this is not acceptable. So can you share with our listeners the story of the avatar that you had on your Facebook for a long, long time and why you chose to do that? Part one. And you include in this chapter an incredibly good list of do's and don'ts. I don't expect you to go through all of them because it's an extensive list, but perhaps you can summarize for people about the guiding principles that sort of govern your participation in social media, but what we might do, and a little bit about why you chose to put up there what you did, because like I said, kittens are nice, but what you had there was far more profound than that.
Yeah, so I'm guessing it was the upside down flag.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
no, I wasn't thinking of your currnt avatar, like, where you're doing yoga.
Yeah, in my yoga.
She has a yoga stance on there right now that I have to say to you, I've thought of trying that, but I just don't think
please don't, Kevin.
Be careful.
No. On behalf of everyone that knows you, please no.
Please don't do it. Sorry.
So it was an upside down flag. And it is a symbol of distress.
And an upside down American flag.
Upside down American flag, yes. And I forget when I had put it up and how long I had put it up, but and alongside the avatar, we own a United States flag. My husband served in the U.S. Air Force for 3 years doing his dental residency. And so he actually wanted a flag to put up occasionally. And I talked with him about hanging that flag also upside down outside. And we had agreed that at the time it was very appropriate. So not only on social media, but in the neighborhood.
Wait a minute. So you flew the American flag upside down in your neighborhood?
Mm-hmm.
Oh God, little Kathy, you are after my own heart. You are my hero. You're not divisive. You are a provocateur of the highest degree, and welcome.
Yeah.
We're glad you're here.
When people say wave your flag, I was like, okay, I will do that upside down. And I did it as a naturalized U.S. citizen who had to learn rules around the flag and its history in a way that my husband, who is American born, did not. Right. And so I come at it from that place of actually understanding what that means, the implications of it, and then even flying the flag outside, right? I made sure that it came back inside at dusk because we don't have a light shining on it, right? I read all of the rules.
You know the rules.
I do. And because certain rules, I feel like as I'm trying to be provocative or disruptive, some other rules are meant to also follow so that that disruption happens within kind of an ordered space, right? And so I flew the flag upside down and had the avatar of the upside down US flag to start the conversation over how many of us in the US have to feel like we are in harm's way before people notice. What does it mean for a population of the United States to be in distress before not only the government, but just our neighbors recognize that we are in distress? And so that was really one for conversation and advocacy and alignment in saying, I personally am not in that physical distress, but people I know and love who are created in God's image, strangers I do not know, but am called to love, are in distress. And if the church is not going to pay attention, then I can use a symbol of the government to
Mhm.
raise awareness.
Right.
And that gets, oddly, Christians in the United States aware.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
take notice. They
They wake
care a
up.
lot.
Mm.
Yeah. Some of them care a lot about the
A
flag.
lot about the flag, yes.
Hmm.
Big time.
So to carry on, and I mean that obviously would have created some discussion on your Facebook page, and then so how you respond to all that in terms of do's and don'ts, and
Yeah.
that sort of reality about how you carry yourself, because that is I would say that's what John Lewis talked about, good trouble. That's creating that's good trouble. Now,
Yeah.
once we get there, how do we live with the baptismal promises that we make to reach out for the dignity of, strive for the dignity, even those that we disagree with, right?
Right. I tell people it may not seem this way on social media, and social media only continues to speed up. Right. So you can leave Facebook, but there's still several other platforms you can be engaged in, and it feels like everything is faster and faster. So it may feel like I am posting something that is a knee-jerk reaction. There are those, but things like that avatar, things like taking a photo of the flag flying upside down, those are done with caution, with prayer, with long pauses, and conversations with friends and family. So I don't do this in isolation. So I would encourage people, social media is a weird thing because you are connecting with others. And the idea is, right, to be connected to others and share things with virtual strangers. But you don't have to do that in isolation. You don't have to do that alone. You should have people who will tell you, hey, I saw that post. Maybe that was a bad idea. Or even people you would talk with prior to posting something. I am often known for sharing emails or saying like I really want to tweet this and sharing that with a close group of friends who are the ones who will say, yeah, I feel you. Don't do that. Don't do that today. Right? Maybe tomorrow, but not today. And so I tell people any response, any reaction, that kind of wanting to cause good trouble, sometimes you need to slow down, slow your roll, pray, pause, pray some more. And then think through how you want to engage with people, because hopefully you recognize what you're posting is going to get feedback, is going to get pushback, is going to get engagement. So if you have not thought that through, I would say, don't pause, don't
put
post.
the brakes on.
Yeah. And then I try to engage people with humility, sometimes with a sense of humor. Sometimes I lose my patience when people come onto my page or onto my post not having done some of the basic work. So I would say that's one thing you can do when you're not posting, but you're reacting to something that you see. Do you, is this somebody, a public figure that you follow? Do some work, like, do you know what they've written, what their book is about? Read the whole prayer before you react to a small bit of the prayer. And maybe pause again. I think recently, I think just in the last day or so, I had an interaction with someone who was like, why are you so hostile? And I didn't respond. My original response was, you Google who I am. You don't even need to ask this question. Your question is a little bit like a troll. Like, I didn't just show up on Instagram 3 days ago, man.
No.
I've got years, years
So-
of stuff you can dig up.
And I don't see much hostility.
Well, and I think that's the hard thing. I think tone is hard to read. And so I do tell, I think I write in my book, you have to take into consideration this is social media.
Right.
And so it isn't a conversation.
No.
There's no facial expressions. It's not Zoom. So know that there can be misunderstandings.
Yeah.
Right.
Again, pause. there's no rush. There really
Pause,
isn't.
breathe, think. That
Breathe,
always helps.
think,
Yeah.
breathe again,
There you
walk
go.
away,
Yeah.
come back.
Don't hit send.
Yeah, don't
write
hit
Don't hit
send.
send
Write
right
it, let
away.
it sit
Yeah.
for a bit.
Yeah.
If
Or
you're still good with it,
enter.
but,
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
Yeah.
you know,
Right. And I think it's one of those, like, listen to your gut. Sometimes I have posted things thinking, oh, I should be clearer. So recently I had posted my participation in a conference for Asian American women. And in my gut, I thought, oh, I should make clear that this space holds speakers who are affirming and non-affirming.
right.
And I didn't listen to my gut, sent it out, and then was called in. And, like, it's not clear. You're right. It's not clear.
Yeah.
And that can be that is a dangerous spot
Very much so.
for the
Yeah.
queer community, and unfair when it's
Yeah.
not clear.
Right.
And I didn't make clear, right? So even if people could assume and know that I am affirming in that post, it was
Right.
not clear, right?
Right.
And so, so I think that was one of those, like, I should have listened to my gut.
Yeah.
And I just was like, oh, I need to get this out because it's like Monday. And
And it's all right. It's okay though, right? Like, that's
Yep.
the other thing, is it's okay to go back and have to post and say, I didn't quite get that. I
Yes.
didn't do it.
Yeah, I
right.
messed that
Or
up. Yeah.
I-
could've
I-
messed
Yeah.
that up, yeah.
I didn't communicate that well. Or in some
Right.
cases, at least in my case, I did that wrong. I'm wrong.
Yep.
I need
Yeah.
to take that
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. And I think it's lessons from life that we forget can be applied to social media.
That's right.
Right.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I did
Yeah,
it wrong.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. And I think I get asked a lot about the social media space. And I think behave in the same way you would at home.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
That's actually a great segue into our final question, because there's a definite difference of tone and use of social media between the last occupant of the White House and the current one.
Lord.
So we'll talk about that a little bit.
Night and day there,
A
Robert.
little bit of a difference.
Yeah.
So we had Robert P. Jones on our podcast recently,
Yes.
and his book, White Too Long, spells out the history of white supremacy in the church. And this was all laid bare, right, in the 2016 election. And so of the last presidency, you write this in the book. Right now, it feels like a hot mess that has spilled into the church. Issues that we have ignored for too long are coming to the forefront. Many faithful evangelical voters supported Trump, citing his promises to nominate a favorable conservative Supreme Court justice and end the legal right to abortion. But many other evangelicals are struggling with the idea that 81% of self-identified white, born-again evangelical Christians and white Catholics said they voted for Trump, while just 16% reported they voted for Hillary Clinton. Taking that statistic into consideration, along with the broader narrative of disenfranchised working class white voters, forced the church into a conversation about race. Many evangelicals, both white and people of color, are asking whether or not it's worth maintaining the evangelical label for various reasons. And many of my friends of color and I spent the days following Trump's win in varying degrees of anger and disbelief. And while we were not surprised that white evangelicals voted for Trump, there was something unnerving about knowing that so many self-identified white Christians, our neighbors in the pews, had voted for a man whose marital history alone would have disqualified a more experienced politician of color.
Mhm.
If the election truly was a reflection of a large segment of the white Christian population wanting to maintain their way of life, what does that mean for the rest of us? And so just wanted to ask you how you're feeling now after the 2020 election. Things are, after a few months, back to some relative peace and stability in the White House and the news cycle right now. Have you had new insight into what the rise of Trumpism means for evangelicalism in the United States?
Well, I mean, yes, it is so much quieter on social media. Oh my goodness.
We don't wake up to a dumpster fire every morning.
Yeah, it's
Every
so
morning.
so interesting. And then I was just talking with a couple friends, like there have been no golf trips. It's really
No
strange.
golf. How does the president work
No
without golf?
Yeah.
No golf. And so, yes, it's quieter on that front. I think I've been asked a lot about the, like, why now the anti-Asian racism and violence. I think it has built up over the last few years, and that's just one lasting impact. One, the permission to be, to take off your white hood and just say what you want to say.
Just be as bigoted as you want.
Right. And share and flaunt the racism in the name of your First Amendment rights.
Or Jesus, even worse.
Or Jesus. Yes. So there's that. And I think what we're also seeing is kind of the pent up frustrations around the pandemic. And now that things seem to be getting, just a little bit better, and vaccinations are happening. So I think people are feeling more willing to be outside. And so I think that also is bringing about a lot of energy. It's what I was saying to folks, is just, people are impatient behind the wheel, and, in the grocery line, you can feel that sometimes. And so the rise of Trumpism, I think it's going to take a while to see if it will go away. I think it has forever marked the white evangelical church and the conversations around that, and the distrust around that, the label of that. What does it mean to affiliate oneself as an evangelical? I mean, I'm not even sure I want to use that terminology. People ask, well, how would you call it? What would you call yourself? How about just a Christian? And we just go back to that. And how that space in particular really was never created with me in mind, right? I'm a naturalized citizen who does not want to be white, who doesn't want to assimilate into that. And so, but just because it's quieter doesn't mean that the injustice went away, right? So that we still have issues at the border, and we still have minors, children incarcerated and held in cages, essentially, and being told they are nicer cages than they were before, right? So there's still that issue. There's still the reality that hate crimes are still happening, right? And then we were in contact shortly around the Atlanta shootings, and then a week later, there was another mass shooting, right? So things, and I knew this, and people of color knew this, it wasn't going to change automatically. I think that it's nice for it to be a little quieter, for that dust to settle down, but to then realize that things just changed in the White House and in the vice president's residence. The US, North America, did not change overnight.
The work still needs to be done. I like what you said about taking off the hood. So, I mean, it's a stark image, but I think the important, to me, the import of that metaphor or that reality is that perhaps in the long run, and I mean, it's hard in the face of such injustice and bigotry and in your face sort of prejudice to see this, but in the long run, it may be that the Trump presidency allows a conversation that just was not happening, because it wasn't as though this stuff was new. The racism didn't pop up overnight, this sort of, what he did was he popped the lid off and gave permission to a whole bunch of people to no longer show any restraint whatsoever. So if that's the case, and so it becomes important, I guess the further relevant question is breathe, because I think America needed that. As your neighbor, we look at it and go, man, you guys need a breath. Like it's like, you need a moment here.
Need a vacation.
You're in a hot mess. I like that's a hot mess. And keep waiting for the meth lab to blow up at the neighbors. It's like, well, what a mess. But don't, I mean, at some point, there needs to now be a further relevant conversation, about the work that needs to be done.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And some days though, to be honest, I'm done conversing.
Yes,
I'm done
Yep,
conversing. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly. Well, we unfortunately, if we had more time, we'd keep conversing, but we have to be done today too, because I
Same.
know you've got things to do as well. So, Kathy, thank you so much for being here. Kathy's book is "Raise Your Voice: Why We Stay Silent and How to Speak Up." Thank you for your voice, for sharing it today with us, and for giving us more to think about and learning and thinking about how we can strive to use our voices and to do that important work. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Ian sends his thanks as well. For those listening or watching on YouTube, if you think Ian got taken up in what some factions of the church believe is a rapture,
he got raptured.
We're left behind. If you're into that sort of thing, which I'm not, but if you're into that sort of thing, Ian actually is a student, and so he had a class to get to, so he went and did that. But he wanted us to make sure we let you know, Kathy, how much he appreciated this conversation as well, as did
Thank
I.
you.
And when you get the Lou Malnati's, have a slice for me.
I will.
Well, that was great. Thanks to Kathy for
Amazing.
talking about her book and raising, again, more important issues that we need to have in the public square to be talking about. And certainly all the things that she was talking about in her book and that we were chatting on today is important for us to be aware of and
That's
keep
right.
the conversations going. So that's
And
great.
to raise our voices and
Mhm,
to
to
continue
raise our
to
voices.
advocate. And we've learned much about what we need to do here and what we all need to do we need to do better.
Good. Well, thanks to Kathy. We look forward to our folks picking up that book. And remember, a lot of our books now are on our website for
That's
our
right.
guests. So please go to there and you can find out how you can pick those up. We have a special bonus episode coming up later this week. Kevin, who do we have?
Sunday, we're going to be releasing an episode with Dr. Yolanda Pierce, who's at Howard University. She's an incredible person. She's the Dean of Howard School of Divinity, in fact, and scholar of African American religious history. She's a public theologian. She's an activist. This book is really compelling about her grandmother, about sort of the matriarchal realities of her life growing up. And just like today, we're in for some really powerful conversation about how we need to continue to fight white supremacy in the church. So,
Right. Okay.
look
So
forward
look for
to
that this Sunday, folks. Okay. Again, before we go, thanks to our sponsors, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. That's a wrap, gentlemen. Thanks so much. I'm Rob
Thank you.
Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George from St. Aidan's Church.
And my name is Ian, and I'm a singer, songwriter, person thing.
Go find his music
and a pen.
and his
Thief.
pens.
He's
Go
a pen thief.
ask for your pen back.
That's how he got into writing songs.
That's right. So these two vicars and this pen thief say good night and have a good week. And Kevin, remember to always look both ways.
Before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!